Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz, and today we continue our team preview series with a look at the Arizona Cardinals. Try to make these as evergreen as possible throughout the offseason, so make sure you go back and check out any teams you might have missed. But without further ado, your 2020 Arizona Cardinals Fantasy Football Team Preview. Get started with a look at Kyler Murray. I mean, his rookie year went about as well as you could have hoped from a fantasy perspective. I mean, the only rookie QB1, so meaning top 12 at their position in fantasy scoring since 2010 are Cam Newton, Andrew Luck, RG3, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, and Mr. Kyler Murray. But, you look a little closer at what he did through the air in particular, and, he was an average to below average passing quarterback, and just QB rating, he was 23rd. Deep ball rating, he was 16th. Under pressure rating, 21st. Kept clean, he was 32nd. I mean, it wasn't great. Now, obviously, was that all on Kyler? No. I mean, he was throwing the ball to Christian Kirk, Larry Fitzgerald, a bunch of pretty much rookie or kind of journeyman wide receivers, no tight ends. It was an offense that, really didn't play to his strengths for the first month of the year. And then, it took him until kind of getting Kenyan Drake to really get the run game going. But it's a situation where I think we should expect him to take a big leap forward, once you add DeAndre Hopkins. And I do kind of see the comparisons between the 2020 Cardinals and the 2019 Browns because, the Cardinals offensive lines, if you look at throughout that offense, that could be the issue. Murray did take a, almost league high amount of sacks last year, did hold the ball a lot, constantly under pressure. Now, if you look a little closer, you'll see he's right up there with Deshaun Watson in terms of, taking sacks that were the quarterback's fault, not so much the offensive line. And I do think in general, it is more on the quarterback than the O-line, but even still, the O-line is, the potential wild card that could rear its ugly head. And then, we look back in 4 months and say, why didn't we care more about this team's faulty offensive line like we did in Cleveland last year? But in fantasy, I think we're going to be okay because his rushing floor is just unlike anything Baker brings to the table. I mean, Murray, he averaged 34 rushing yards per game last season. That is sixth among all QBs to ever start at least 16 games in NFL history. So, again, last year, Murray wasn't even that good of a passer. He did his thing as a rusher, but even then I felt like he could have, potentially been utilized even more, and the guy was still a QB1. So he's going to have to, work a little harder to meet his ADP. Now he's going as a top 5 signal caller instead of, outside the top 10 or 12, but still a situation where, he already proved he can supply QB1 fantasy goodness without, high-end receivers at his disposal. Adding Hopkins should, definitely help Kyler get up there. Because, you saw the arm talent. You saw him make the splash plays where if he can do it a little more consistently, he's going to be anyone's idea of a top 5 QB. So, very much on the Kyler train going to 2020 and beyond. And honestly, as we move on to running back, I am more than happy to continue to take a chance on Kenyan Drake. Did a backfield splits article last week, and I am projecting Drake to see about 75% of the offensive snaps, assuming everyone stays healthy. Chase Edmonds at 20%, Eno Benjamin 5%. It was a 1 RB backfield last season. You look at the first 6 weeks of the season when David Johnson was the guy, and he plays 86% snaps, 60%, 87%, 86%, 69%, 75%. He gets hurt. Chase Edmonds comes in, plays 94% snaps in his first week in there. He gets hurt. Drake gets traded for. He comes in 84%, 64%, 90%. Bye week to get guys healthier. Didn't matter. Drake finishes off the season with 79%, 66%, 75%, 81%, 96% snap rates. That is not normal, everyone. We only see that out of really Christian McCaffrey, Ezekiel Elliott, and Saquon Barkley league-wide. This is a 1 RB backfield, and that's why I've had Drake, in my top 7 backs for most of the offseason. And yeah, the injury he suffered isn't great, but talking to, Dr. Evan Porras from Fantasy Points, he couldn't be less concerned. Even listening to Coach Cliff Kingsbury, who said, it's just some normal nicks and bruises, normal camp stuff. It's just kind of precautionary with him, knowing what he'll be able to do. They know what Drake brings to the table. He had this boot on last offseason as well. It's an injury that everyone seems to be at peace with. Seems like more rest than anything. And, when he's out there, it's going to be the Kenyan Drake show. So absolutely love buying Drake this year, despite, the mini hiccup here in training camp. And the enthusiasm extends to Chase Edmonds, though, because just where he's been going in drafts. Give me Chase Edmonds over someone like Marlon Mack or Kerryon Johnson 8 days of the week, because even if injuries occur in those backfields, those guys are not getting the 3 down role that we know Edmonds will get if, Drake misses time. So maybe, last year's one RB backfield was more due to injuries and, this and that. I don't think so. But let's say that's the case and this is more of a 50-50 or 60-40 split. Like, okay, that's great then. You want Edmonds on your team. He has a chance to, eventually overtake Drake for the role. Or it is the Drake show, and then we have Edmonds, who he's one injury away from having, an elusive 3 down role and a great offense. So I think at his current ADP, Edmonds, his range of outcomes is pretty much great, whatever happens, And some people have had, Benjamin still wondering what he can do. And, to his credit, Kingsbury's talked about how they're happy to have 3 solid running backs, but just historically, the amount of running backs, drafted outside the top 3 rounds that do anything of note as a rookie, very, very small. You see the exceptions here and there with your Philip Lindsays of the world, but, I'm not going to bet on a 7th-round running back. Maybe, is an exception to the rule, but I do not think he will be a factor in 2020. Moving on to the wide receiver room. Yeah, DeAndre Hopkins. Wow. Like, talk about adding a great receiver. And look, it hasn't been great historically. It's actually been really bad when you look at the fantasy success of wide receivers on a new team after they were traded during the offseason. The only guy over the last decade to post a top 12 PPR season after being traded during the offseason was Brandon Marshall, and he did it twice. I mean, you talk about a guy that just imagine blaming Brandon Marshall for not winning a playoff game as the dude's bringing down, 1,500 yards and double-digit scores. Could not be me. But Hopkins, I think it's fair to say that he has been the most talented wide receiver traded in the offseason over the past decade. So I'm not, I'm not down on him. He's my wide receiver 5. We'll get, specific rankings more in a bit. But I am taking a bunch of running backs before him in drafts, though, because there is enough concern, I think, with will he get the highest end target share that we've grown used to in order to meet that value. And okay, I would not be shocked if he joins Brandon Marshall, in the group of wide receivers that are produced on their new squad. And even if he doesn't, I mean, his floor still is a wide receiver 2, I think. But even then, I mean, you're paying for Hopkins at his ceiling. You're using a top 5 wide receiver selection to get his services, and he's going to need to kind of reach his ceiling in order to meet value there. So not a guy I've consistently come away with in a lot of drafts, but you see sometimes where he's still available in the 3rd round and people are really getting off him. I think that's when you should pounce. But I mean, this is the issue. I mean, over the last 5 seasons, he's had 192 targets, 151, 174, 163, and 150. I mean, Christian Kirk was the Cardinals wide receiver 1 last year, and if you just take his average in targets per game and extrapolate it over 16, it's only equaling 133. So yes, it would make sense if Hopkins, sees 150 plus targets. He's an alpha receiver and he deserves it. But, Deshaun Watson to Kyler Murray, that's a downgrade for right now. And if we're looking at similar to lower target share and probable fewer yards per attempt, you see the case why guys, have Hopkins ranked in the teens among wide receivers. I think he's talented enough to continue to do his thing. I mean, we've just seen him with these quarterbacks over the years. I mean, Hopkins has averaged 22.8 PPR points per game with Brandon Weeden under center, 20.8 with Tom Savage, 19.7 with Brian Hoyer, 18.7 with Ryan Mallett, 17.3 with TJ Yates. It's seriously absurd some of the quarterbacks he had to go through in Houston before getting Deshaun Watson, who he averaged a cool 19.7 PPR points per game with. I think, when it's all said and done, Hopkins will join Marshall as, the only wide receiver 1s to replicate that on a new squad after being traded in the offseason, but I just don't think we're necessarily going to see that, top 3 usual season from Hopkins, and that's why I usually haven't been ending up with him in drafts. I really haven't been on either Christian Kirk or Larry Fitzgerald as well. I mean, look, Kirk and Fitz were more or less 1A, 1B last season, and for Kirk not to really do anything last year other than that game against Tampa Bay where he scored 3 times, it's a little bit alarming. I mean, that was his best case scenario now for years, just to really dominate target share, and he wasn't able to do much with it. So if it was like more fantasy friendly targets, that'd be one thing, but especially if Kirk just keeps living on these short dink and dunk screens, it's going to be one of these situations where he's only going to be playable in PPR leagues, and it's got to be a good matchup because Hopkins is either going to dominate target share or we're just going to see kind of Kirk just seep into that. Okay, is he even the number 2 guy with what Fitz and maybe even Kenyan Drake do in terms of their target share? So Fitz, the guy keeps balling out in week 1, so maybe do that before the father time really starts rearing its head after September. But no, I think in general you should be fading Kirk and Larry Fitz at cost. Andy Isabella is the interesting guy, and would love to see him get more opportunities. Last year he had a wild 88-yard touchdown catch and run against the 49ers that showed off his speed, and he also took a slant against the Buccaneers, I believe it was, and turned that into like a 50-yard gain. So when you look at Kyler Murray's adjusted yards per attempt to receiver, it's like Isabella by double the next closest guy. Obviously, that's because of his, super small target share he had last season. He's not going to keep that up. But the word is that he is going to be their second slot receiver in 4 wide receiver sets. Cardinals utilized that on, I believe, 26% of Kyler Murray's attempts last year, and they were doing it even more in the first month of the season before, Kingsbury kind of had to reel things in a little bit. They just weren't functioning as well as they really needed to. Added a more consistent tight end into the offense. So Isabella could flirt with like a 50% snap rate potentially as the number 4 wide receiver in the offense, but like Kirk, like Fitzgerald, I just think it's going to be a little too condensed behind Hopkins for any of these guys to provide much weekly value. And yeah, taking us to the tight end position, I just don't really think it's a unit to target. Dan Arnold in super deep leagues, maybe. My guy, Roto-World John Daigle, certainly is, the biggest Dan Arnold stan I know. He's, been a guy that smart coaches like Sean Payton have wanted to have on the squad, but we still got Maxx Williams there. I wonder if, Arnold's even going to be the de facto tight end. And in Arizona, it's a situation where, like, okay, even if you are the tight end, who even knows if he's going to be playing 50% snaps of the game, and the targets are even less of a guarantee. So Dan Arnold, likely better, real life option that maybe flashes here or there than anything resembling consistent fantasy. So moving on to the ranks, I have Kyler Murray as my QB4, 1 spot behind Dak Prescott, 1 spot ahead of Deshaun Watson. It's that rushing floor, and he's going to take a step forward as a passer through natural year 2 progression and adding one of the game's top 5 most talented wide receivers. All the reason in the world to believe the arrow is definitely pointing up for Kyler, and the only reason I do think Deshaun Watson is still better for now, and there's an argument that he should be ahead of Kyler just in terms of pure upside, if the Texans just have to throw the ball more than ever. But I do think Kyler, dual threat nature, it's a fantasy football cheat code when you're getting the rushing production out of the quarterback position. He deserves to be in anyone's top 5 signal callers heading into 2020. RB, I have Kenyan Drake as my RB7, 1 spot behind Dalvin Cook, 1 spot ahead of Derrick Henry. If you want to put Henry above Drake, I don't hate it. More and more this offseason, we've seen, Darrington Evans maybe not have that pass down role we kind of assume for him in week 1. So if Henry is getting the 3-down role and Drake's getting a 3-down role, I mean, okay, give me Henry in that case. It's still close though, but I just would say don't take the lazy approach and say, well, Drake's not had 200 plus touches or whatever the threshold is, even dating back to college. Like the biggest and most relevant, not the biggest, but the most relevant split we have of Drake is the final 8 games of 2019 when he joined the Cardinals and they used him as a legit 3-down workhorse back. He's a great player. He owns some of the best yards after contact per attempt seasons that I've seen in the PFF database. It's all coming together for him. And, you really don't even have to draft him as the RB7. I'm more than happy to get him. If you can get him in the second round of a draft, absolutely. And I don't even hate using the end of a first round pick on him as well. Chase Edmonds is my RB37, 1 spot behind Tony Pollard, 1 spot ahead of Phillip Lindsay. I've been preaching this all offseason. I think, Latavius Murray, Madison, Pollard, and Edmonds are the handcuffs to get. Okay, if you have Drake, maybe you don't want Edmonds because there's not really a situation where both those guys ball out. You'd be better off, picking up Pollard. But again, there's not 32 legit handcuffs around the league. So really just focus on these 4, regardless of who your other running backs might be. Wide receiver, as I said, DeAndre Hopkins, wide receiver 5, 1 spot behind Julio Jones, 1 spot ahead of Adam Thielen. It's just where I guess I have Hopkins ranked in the grand scheme of things. He's my wide receiver. He's my overall ranked number 18 player. I'm taking George Kittle ahead of him. I'm taking my, RBs up through Miles Sanders, maybe even Josh Jacobs, but that's a bigger discussion. But 12 or 13 RBs ahead of Hopkins. I do buy into, just the idea that we should generally fade players switching teams. It kind of gets the excitement going. I think it gets the ADPs a little bit displaced in terms of what they would otherwise be. And yeah, so great player. He's not going to fall off, I think, and, give us like a OBJ wide receiver 25 as season, but I do worry if, that top 3, top 5 season is still, firmly in his range of outcomes. Tight end, yeah, I'm not touching this unit at all, as I was saying. I mean, Dan Arnold, if you're in a really deep league, dynasty version, maybe, but otherwise I would pass. Christian Kirk is my wide receiver, 55, one spot behind Paris Campbell, one spot ahead of Maxx Williams. I just worry about the target share, guys. That's really all it is. I mean, for him to do so little on 8.3 targets per game last year, I mean, that number is only going to go down, and I just haven't really seen enough from Kirk in terms of kind of pure talent out there on the field and just ability to make me think that, a major resurgence is coming. Fitz, my wide receiver, 81, one spot behind John Ross, one spot ahead of Kendrick Bourne. Will in all likelihood be a free agent in most leagues. Moving on to the win total, Cardinals are sitting at 7.5. You look at the rest of the NFC West, we have the 49ers, 10.5, Seahawks over there at 9, and the Rams at 9. So, predicting the Cardinals to finish last again, I think it's a fair win total. I mean, after the hype the Browns had last year, it's good to see no one really expecting the Cardinals, to make that leap into the playoffs. The defense is in a situation where Patrick Peterson, coming back from injury, got boat raced by Michael Thomas. I'm sorry, come back for suspension, not injury. Boat raced by Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. He got better as the year went on. He had a really good game against Odell Beckham towards the end of the season, but I don't think he's really anyone's idea of a top 5 cornerback at this point in his career. Chandler Jones, one of the most just underrated defensive ends in recent memory. That dude is guaranteed pretty much for double-digit sacks a season, and he's wreaking havoc just with pressure even in between the sacks. Adding Isaiah Simmons, not having Budda Baker there too. This is not going to be a defense we can just attack with tight ends every single week and expect, consistent tight end 1 production. So we'll see what happens there. 7.5 is a really good number. I'll go with the over because I think it's a competitive division that every team's going to kind of, be in that 8-8, 10-6 range. I wouldn't bet all that much money on it because I would favor the Cardinals to be last place in this division, but I think the Rams are honestly closer to 7.5 than 9. So I would say just kind of because it seems like Vegas may have, displaced the Cardinals a little bit too much in 4th place. I think they should be a little closer than the Rams. I would take the over for that reason. So that's going to do it, everyone. I'm Ian Hartitz. Thank you for listening. This has been the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. And until next time, take care.
Thanks for watching the PFF YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe, all you have to do is push the button. Don't forget everything you get. A little fantasy, push the button. A little green line for the gambling aspects of the game, push the button. College football, push the button. The YouTube channel from PFF.